There was a rule on certain South Carolina plantations that made absolutely no sense to outsiders. It wasn't about work hours, cotton quotas, or even where people could walk. This rule seemed arbitrary, almost childish in its specificity. Yet it was enforced with a brutality that terrified every soul who lived under it. For 73 years, more than 200 people obeyed this rule without exception, passing it down as sacred knowledge to their children. When Union soldiers finally arrived in 1865 and asked why everyone still followed it, even after their masters had fled, the answer they received made several officers physically ill. What they discovered in the days that followed would lead to one of the most suppressed military reports of the Reconstruction era, a document that wouldn't surface in public archives until 1982. Before we continue with the story of Belmare Plantation and the rule that governed it with an iron fist, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, and down in the comments, tell me what state or city you're watching from. This story goes places you won't believe, and I want to know who's brave enough to hear it all the way through. The rule was simple: never let your shadow touch the well. Belmare Plantation sat on the firs in the 100 acres of prime bottomland in the low country, about 40 miles inland from Charleston. The land had been in the Grantham family since 1748, passed from father to son through 3 generations. By 1792, when our story begins, it was one of the most profitable rice plantations in the state, working nearly 200 enslaved people in the flooded fields that stretched toward the Kahi River. The plantation house itself was impressive by the standards of the day. A 3-story structure of brick and cypress wood with broad piazzas facing south, to catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the suffocating humidity. The kitchen stood separate, as was common, connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Beyond that, the counting house, the overseer's cottage, the stables, and then the long row of cabins where the enslaved population lived in conditions that were barely adequate, even by the standards of that brutal time. But it was the well that dominated the landscape, both physically and psychologically. It stood in the center of the workyard, exactly 147 feet from the main house, positioned with mathematical precision that seemed odd for such a utilitarian structure. The well was deep, unusually so, more than 200 feet, according to the enslaved men who had dug it under the supervision of Thomas Grantham himself in 1791. The opening was wider than most wells, nearly 8 feet across, surrounded by a stone rim that rose 3 feet above the ground. An iron framework supported a pulley system for the bucket, and around the entire structure ran a circle of white stones, each one painted and carefully placed exactly 10 feet from the well's edge. This was the boundary. This was where shadows were forbidden to fall. Thomas Grantham, the plantation's master in 1792, was not known for outward cruelty by the standards of his time and place, which is to say that he was nevertheless capable of extraordinary violence in the enforcement of his absolute authority. He was 46 years old, a widower who had lost his wife to yellow fever 3 years earlier. His 3 children had all died in childhood of various fevers and accidents common to the era. He ran Belmare with rigid efficiency, maintaining detailed records of every bushel of rice harvested, every birth and death among the enslaved population, every expense and profit. His overseer, a man named Declan Poot, was cut from different cloth. Poot was 32, originally from the Virginia Piedmont. A man who had worked his way up from field hand to overseer through a combination of ruthlessness and a peculiar talent for breaking resistant spirits. He had pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything and a voice that could carry across the rice fields on the stillest day. Among the enslaved population, there were several people whose experiences would become central to what happened at Belmare. There was Rachel, 28 years old, who worked in the main house and had a gift for remembering every detail of every conversation she overheard. Her husband, Isaac, was a blacksmith, valuable enough to have a small degree of autonomy in his work. Their daughter, Judith, was 7 years old in 1792, old enough to understand that the well was dangerous, but too young to understand why. There was also Marcus, 53, who had been at Belmare longer than anyone else, who had helped dig that well and knew its secrets. And there was Danina, 19, newly arrived from a plantation near Georgetown, who had not yet learned all the rules that governed life at Belmare. The white stone circle around the well was repainted every spring. The enslaved people assigned to this task worked on their hands and knees with brushes, never standing, never allowing their shadows to stretch across that boundary. Everyone at Belmere knew the rule. Everyone obeyed it. But few understood why. It was Rachel who saw what happened to Danina, though she never spoke of it directly. Not for decades. The day was August 14th, 1792. Rachel remembered because it was the anniversary of her son's death 3 years earlier. A memory that made her move through her tasks in the main house with mechanical precision, trying not to think. The heat that afternoon was oppressive, even by low country standards. The air hung thick and still, heavy with moisture from the rice fields. Thunderheads were building in the west, promising rain that wouldn't come for hours. Danina had been at Belmere for 6 weeks. She was quick-witted and strong, but she had a tendency to question things, to ask why when most people at Belmere had learned that. Why was a dangerous question. That afternoon, she had been tasked with carrying water from the well to the kitchen, a job that required multiple trips in the grinding heat. Rachel was at the kitchen house window shelling peas when she saw Danina approach the well for her 4th trip. The sun was lowering in the west, maybe 2 hours before sunset, and the shadows were starting to lengthen. Danina stopped at the white stone circle like everyone did, and waited. But the sun's angle was wrong. Her shadow stretched across the white stones, falling perhaps 18 inches beyond the boundary, touching the stone rim of the well itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Danina stood there waiting for her shadow to move as the earth turned, as anyone would. It was barely a violation, hardly worth noting. Then Thomas Grantham walked out of the counting house. Rachel's hands stopped moving. She watched as Grantham approached the well with the measured pace of a man who has all the time in the world. Poot emerged from the stable, as if summoned by some signal Rachel couldn't detect. The 2 men converged on Danina, who was now backing away from the well, her empty bucket forgotten. What followed was punishment, so severe that Rachel turned away from the window, unable to watch, but she could hear it. Everyone at Belmere could hear it. The sound carried across the workyard, across the rice fields, a sound that made birds fall silent in the trees. When it was over, Danina was carried to the cabin she shared with 7 other women. Rachel was sent to tend to her, bringing water and clean cloth. Though there was little she could do beyond basic care. Danina's back was ruined. Rachel had seen many people whipped before. It was impossible to avoid in her position, but this was something beyond the usual cruelty. This was methodical, calculated to cause maximum suffering while ensuring survival. Why? Danina whispered at one point, her voice barely audible. My shadow barely touched it. Why? Rachel didn't answer. Because she didn't know, but she knew enough to understand that the rule was absolute. Shadow and well could never meet, not even for a moment, not even by accident. That night, Rachel lay beside Isaac in their cabin and told him what she had seen. Isaac was quiet for a long time before he spoke. Marcus told me something once, Isaac said quietly, aware that sound carried between the thin walls of the cabins. About when they dug that well, he said they dug for weeks. Master Grantham was there every day measuring, checking the depth. They went down more than 200 feet, Marcus said. And when they finally hit water, Grantham made them dig another 20 feet below that. Why? Rachel asked. Marcus didn't know. But he said the water that came up tasted strange, metallic and cold, so cold it hurt your teeth. And he said that when they were down in that hole, in the deepest part, they heard sounds like someone talking, but the words weren't English, weren't any language he knew. Rachel felt cold despite the August heat. Marcus is old. Maybe he remembers it wrong. Maybe, Isaac agreed, but neither of them believed it. Danina recovered after a fashion. She walked with a permanent limp after that day, and her spirit was broken in a way that Rachel recognized from having seen it before. She never questioned anything again. She obeyed every rule without hesitation, and she never ever let her shadow fall across those white stones. But the question remained, whispered in the darkness of the cabins, passed between people in the brief moments when they were out of earshot of the overseer. Why was the rule so absolute? What was in that well that made shadows dangerous? The years passed. Seasons turned, People were born and people died, and Belmare continued its operations with mechanical efficiency. The rule about the well never changed, never softened, never showed any flexibility. Thomas Grantham aged, but did not mellow. If anything, he became more rigid in his enforcement of the rule as time went on. By 1800, he was 54 years old. His hair gone completely gray, his face lined from years of low-country sun. But his eyes remained sharp, and he still walked out to check the well every day, sometimes twice a day, making sure the white stones were properly maintained, making sure no shadows had fallen where they shouldn't. Poot remained as overseer, growing older and meaner. He had married a woman from Charleston and built a small house near the main plantation. But he remained at Belmare every day from sunrise to sunset, watching, enforcing, punishing. Marcus died in 1803 at the age of 64, which was extraordinarily old for an enslaved person in the Low Country. He went quietly in his sleep, and with him died whatever first-hand knowledge he had of the well's construction. But before he died, he told Isaac something that Isaac never forgot. "The well don't want water," Marcus said in his final days. "That ain't what it's for." The enslaved community at Belmare developed elaborate strategies to avoid violating the rule. They learned to calculate the sun's position instinctively, to judge shadow lengths with mathematical precision. Mothers taught their children to be hyper, aware of where their shadows fell at all times. People would wait for minutes, sometimes longer, for the sun to move enough that they could approach the well safely. A new practice emerged, something that hadn't been ordered by Grantham, but which he allowed. People began to approach the well only in pairs. One person would watch the other's shadow while they drew water, ready to call out a warning if the shadow started to drift toward the boundary. It was a system born of collective fear, and it worked. For years, there were no violations. Rachel's daughter Judith grew up, became a woman, married a carpenter named Abel. They had a son in 1809, a boy they named Thomas after the master, as was expected. Little Thomas, always called Little Thomas to distinguish him from Thomas Grantham, grew up hearing stories about the well, about the rule, about what happened to people who broke it. "Why does Master Grantham care so much about shadows?" Little Thomas asked his grandmother Rachel when he was 8 years old. Rachel had been thinking about that question for 17 years by then. She had her theories cobbled together from observation, whispered conversations, and things she'd overheard while working in the main house, but she had never spoken them aloud. Some rules, she told her grandson, ain't about what makes sense. They're about keeping something locked up tight. "What's locked up?" "I don't know, child, and I pray you never find out." But in 1817, that prayer would go unanswered. Thomas Grantham fell ill that summer. It came on suddenly, a fever that burned through him like wildfire. The plantation doctor came from Charleston, examined him, prescribed the usual treatments of the time, bleeding, purging, various tinctures and tonics. Nothing helped. Grantham lingered for 3 weeks, burning with fever, sometimes lucid and sometimes raving. Rachel was assigned to sit with him during his illness, to bring water, to change bedclothes, to listen to his fevered rambling. Most of it was incoherent. But on the night of August 23, 1817, as a thunderstorm rolled across the low country, Grantham opened his eyes and looked at Rachel with perfect clarity. "The well must be watched," he said, his voice firm. "Every day, every hour, the shadows cannot touch it." "Yes, Master," Rachel said, because that was the only safe response. "You don't understand," Grantham continued. "None of you understand. My father found something in 1748, under the ground. Something old, older than the colony, older than the Indians. He built this plantation over it because he thought he could contain it. But it needs constant vigilance. The well is not a well, it's a seal, and shadow is the key that could unlock it." Rachel felt her blood turn cold. "Master Grantham, you need to rest. The shadow must never fall," Grantham said, his eyes burning with fever and something else. Something that looked like terror. "If it does, if the seal is broken, what comes up won't be water. Promise me. Promise me you'll watch the well." "I promise," Rachel said, because a dying man deserved that much, even if she didn't understand what she was promising. Grantham died 3 days later. He was 61 years old. His will, read by a lawyer from Charleston, left Belmer to a distant cousin in Virginia, a man named Robert Grantham, who had never seen the plantation. For 2 months, Belmer existed in a strange limbo. Poot continued as overseer, maintaining operations, but without clear ownership. The plantation felt different. The rule about the well remained in force. Poot enforced it as brutally as ever, but people began to wonder if it might change under new ownership. Robert Grantham arrived in October of 1817. He was 38 years old, had a wife and 4 children, and had made his money in tobacco rather than rice. He spent his first week at Belmer touring the property, examining the books, asking questions about operations. On the 8th day, he asked about the well. "Why the white stones?" he asked as they stood in the workyard. "And why does everyone seem so careful about how they approach it?" Poot explained the rule about shadows. Robert Grantham listened with an expression of increasing disbelief. "That's absurd," he said when Poot finished. "Shadows can't hurt a well. This is superstitious nonsense. Your cousin was very particular about it." Poot said carefully, "My cousin is dead, and I won't run a plantation based on madness." Robert Grantham walked to the well, deliberately standing so that his shadow fell across the white stones, across the stone rim, across the dark water far below. See, nothing happens. He stood there for a full minute, his shadow stretching across the well in the afternoon light. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Nothing happened that day or the next day or the day after that. Within a week, the rule was officially abolished. People could approach the well whenever they wanted, however they wanted, shadows or no shadows. The white stones were painted over, left to weather away. The well became just a well, a source of water, nothing more. The enslaved population obeyed because they had no choice. But they obeyed with a sick feeling of dread that wouldn't go away. Rachel remembered what Thomas Grantham had said in his delirium. "The well is not a well, it's a seal." If that was true, what had they just unsealed? For 18 months, nothing happened. Life at Belmer continued under Robert Grantham's management. He was a more lenient master than Thomas had been, though that was a relative term. He didn't forbid the shadow rule. People could avoid the well's shadow if they wanted, but he made it clear he thought it was foolishness. The rice harvest of 1818 was good. The harvest of 1819 was even better. Robert Grantham began to expand operations, buying more land, bringing in more enslaved people from auctions in Charleston. Belmer was profitable, and the well was just a well. But Rachel watched the well. She couldn't help herself. Every day from the windows of the main house, she would find herself looking at it, waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever did. The water tasted the same as it always had, cold and slightly metallic. People drew from it daily. Shadows fell across it at all hours. The world continued to turn. Maybe Thomas Grantham had been mad, she thought. Maybe the fever had destroyed his mind before it killed him, and his ravings about seals and ancient things were just the delusions of a dying brain. Maybe the rule about shadows had been nothing more than one man's peculiar obsession. Meaningless and cruel, she almost convinced herself of that. Then, in March of 1821, the water changed. It started with a smell. Nothing dramatic. Just a faint odor like old iron that hadn't been there before. The enslaved people who drew water daily noticed it first, mentioned it to each other in quiet voices. Rachel brought it to Poot's attention, and he brought it to Robert Grantham's attention. Grantham had the well examined. The pulley system was checked, the stones around the rim inspected. A man was lowered down on ropes to look at the water level and the wall stones. Everything appeared normal. The smell was probably just some mineral leaching into the water from the surrounding soil. The examining engineer said there was nothing to worry about. But the smell got stronger. By April, everyone could detect it when they drew water. By May, the water itself had taken on a faint reddish tinge, like rust dissolving in it. Robert Grantham had another well dug, this one farther from the house, a normal well of normal depth. The new well's water was clear and clean, so people began using it for the main house and kitchen. The old well was used less and less until finally, it was used only when the new well's bucket was already in use. The smell from the old well got worse. By summer of 1821, it was noticeable from 30 feet away. A thick copper smell that made people's stomachs turn. Robert Grantham had the well covered with a wooden lid to contain the odor. The lid helped, but not much. Something was happening down in that deep darkness, something that turned the waterfall. That's when people started getting sick. It began with headaches. People who had been near the old well would complain of throbbing pain behind their eyes, pain that would last for hours. Then came the dreams. Vivid, disturbing dreams that multiple people reported. Dreams of being underground, of hearing voices in languages that didn't exist, of touching something ancient and angry. Isaac was one of the first to experience the dreams. He woke Rachel one night in July shaking, covered in cold sweat despite the summer heat. "I was in the well," he said, his voice unsteady. "I was down in the water, and I wasn't drowning. I was breathing the water, and there were others down there with me. People I didn't know. People who had been there for a long time, and they were trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. But I couldn't understand the words." "It was just a dream," Rachel said, though she didn't believe it. "It wasn't just a dream. It was a memory. Like someone else's memory got put in my head." Rachel held him until he stopped shaking. But she knew what he meant because she'd been having the dreams too. Everyone who had been close to the well was having them, and the dreams were getting worse. By August, Robert Grantham couldn't deny that something was wrong. The smell from the old well had become unbearable. The wooden lid did nothing to contain it anymore, and people were getting genuinely sick now. Not just headaches and bad dreams, but fevers, tremors, a bone, deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. Grantham had a mason from Charleston come to examine the well. The mason, a practical man named Yates, lowered himself down on ropes with a lantern. He got about 50 feet down before he started screaming to be pulled up. When he reached the surface, his face was gray and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his tools. "What's down there?" Grantham demanded. "I don't know," Yates said. "I don't know, but it's not water. Not anymore. It's something else, and it's rising. Rising. The water level is higher than it should be. Significantly higher, and it's not water." Yates shook his head. "I'm not going back down there. Not for any amount of money. You should fill that well in. Fill it in and forget it ever existed." Robert Grantham was not a man who believed in curses or supernatural forces, but he was a practical man who could recognize a problem. He had the well filled in, or tried to. Workers dumped load after load of rocks and dirt into it, but the level never seemed to rise significantly. It was as if the well was bottomless, consuming everything thrown into it without ever filling. After a week of futile effort, Grantham ordered the well sealed instead. A wooden platform was built over the opening, then covered with bricks and mortar, creating a solid cap over the well's mouth. The work was done hastily, almost desperately. When it was finished, the smell was mostly contained, and people began to feel better. For a while, everyone believed the problem was solved. The well was sealed. Whatever was down there would stay down there. Life could return to normal. But in September of 1821, little Thomas went missing. The boy was 12 years old, small for his age, quiet and thoughtful. He had always been curious about the well, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Rachel had warned him countless times to stay away from it, even after it was sealed. But Thomas was at that age where warnings from adults only made things more interesting. He disappeared on a Thursday afternoon. His mother, Judith, had sent him to carry tools to his father, Abel, at the carpentry shop. Thomas never arrived. Abel went looking for him when he didn't show up. Judith searched the cabins. Soon, everyone was looking, calling his name across Belmer's 100 acres. They found him at sunset, standing on top of the sealed well. He was facing the main house, perfectly still, his arms at his sides. His eyes were open, but he didn't respond when people called to him. Isaac was the first to reach him, climbing onto the brick platform that covered the old well's mouth. "Thomas," Isaac said, touching his grandson's shoulder. "Thomas, can you hear me?" The boy turned his head, looked at Isaac with eyes that didn't seem to see him. When he spoke, his voice was wrong, too deep, too old, like someone else was using his throat to speak. "The seal is broken," little Thomas said. 3 years of shadows. 3 years of light falling where it shouldn't. The door is open. The water rises. We rise with it. Then he collapsed. Isaac caught him before he could hit the bricks, carried him down from the sealed well, ran with him to the cabin, while Rachel rushed ahead to prepare a bed. The boy was burning with fever, his skin hot enough to hurt to touch. For 3 days he drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he was himself, frightened and confused. When the fever took him, he spoke in that other voice, saying things that made no sense. He talked about 1748, about Thomas Grantham's father finding something in the ground. He talked about a network of caves under the plantation, about water that had been old when the world was young, about something that had been trapped and was now slowly waking up. It needs shadow to rise, little Thomas said during one of his fevered episodes, gripping Rachel's hand with surprising strength. Light keeps it down. Shadow lets it up. 3 years of shadows on the water, and now the seal is cracked. It's coming up slowly, but it's coming up. And when it reaches the surface, when it breathes air again, everything dies. Everyone dies. The whole plantation, then the county, then the state. It spreads like water, like shadow, and it doesn't stop. Hush, child, Rachel said, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth. You're just sick. But she knew he wasn't just sick. She had seen too much, heard too much, felt too much to deny what was happening anymore. On the 4th day, little Thomas's fever broke. He woke up weak but coherent with no memory of what he'd said during his illness. But he did remember being on top of the sealed well. Remembered hearing voices calling from below. Remembered feeling like something was pulling him down, wanting to drag him into the darkness. Grandma, he said quietly. What's under the well? Rachel didn't answer. Because she didn't know how to explain something she barely understood herself. Robert Grantham, for his part, had had enough. He was a practical man confronting an impractical situation. And his solution was practical too. He ordered the sealed well destroyed completely. Workers broke through the brick cap, then began demolishing the stone rim, then started excavating the entire structure. The plan was to expose the well completely, remove the stone lining, and fill in the hole with solid earth compacted down in layers. The work began on a Monday. By Wednesday, the workers were exhausted and terrified. The smell that came up from the exposed well was worse than ever, and the water level had indeed risen. It was now less than 100 feet down when it should have been more than 200, and the water itself was wrong. It was thick, viscous, dark red, brown like old blood, and it moved in ways that water shouldn't move, forming patterns on its surface that looked almost deliberate. On Thursday, one of the workers fell into the well. His name was Benjamin, a young man of 23 who'd been working on the demolition crew. He was standing too close to the edge when some stones gave way beneath him. He fell in with a scream that cut off abruptly when he hit the water. 5 men grabbed ropes and went in after him immediately. They pulled him out within minutes, but those minutes had been enough. Benjamin was alive, but changed. His skin had taken on a gray pallor, and his eyes had a distant look, as if he were seeing something very far away. He was breathing, but barely, and he wouldn't respond to anyone. They carried him to the plantation hospital, a small building where the enslaved and occasionally injured workers were treated. The plantation doctor, a man named Hughes, who split his time between Belmare and 2 other plantations, examined Benjamin and found nothing physically wrong with him beyond the expected cuts and bruises from the fall. But Benjamin wouldn't wake up. He lay in bed, breathing slowly, eyes open, but unseeing for 3 days. Then he died. No apparent cause. He just stopped breathing. The demolition stopped immediately. Robert Grantham, finally acknowledging that he was dealing with something beyond his understanding, had the well sealed again, this time with iron plates welded together over the opening, then covered with 3 feet of concrete. It was the strongest seal that mid-19th century engineering could provide. But everyone at Belmare knew it wouldn't be enough. Just when they thought they'd seen it all, the horror at Belmare intensified. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The answer came from an unexpected source, a scholar from Charleston who had heard rumors about Belmer's troubles and came to investigate. His name was Dr. Edmund Cordry, and he was a professor of natural philosophy at what would later become the College of Charleston. He had made a study of unusual geological formations in the low country and had heard about the well at Belmer. He heard about the sickness, the strange water, and came with permission from Robert Grantham to examine the situation. Cordry arrived on a gray October morning, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and heavy over the rice fields, promising rain that never quite comes. He was 52 years old, lean and weathered, with the careful, observant eyes of a man who had spent his life looking closely at things others overlooked. He brought with him an assistant, a young man named Peter Whitfield, and enough scientific equipment to fill 2 wagons. They set up their investigation in one of the empty storage buildings near the sealed well. For 3 days, they took measurements, examined soil samples, tested the air quality around the sealed structure, and interviewed anyone who would talk to them. Cordry had a methodical approach that reminded Rachel of Thomas Grantham's meticulous record-keeping. But where Grantham had been motivated by profit and control, Cordry seemed driven by genuine curiosity. On the morning of the 3rd day, Cordry asked to examine the sealed well more closely. Robert Grantham agreed, though with visible reluctance. A crew of workers carefully removed a section of the concrete cap, creating an opening just wide enough for instruments to be lowered into the darkness below. The smell that emerged was overpowering. It hadn't diminished at all in the month since the well had been sealed. If anything, it seemed stronger, more concentrated, a thick metallic odor that made eyes water and stomachs turn. Cordry had his assistant lower a thermometer on a long chain. When it came back up, both men stared at the reading in disbelief. 41 degrees. Cordry said quietly, "That's impossible. The ambient temperature is 73 degrees. Water this deep should be warmer, not colder, unless—" He trailed off, lost in thought. Then he had Whitfield lower a jar on a rope, trying to collect a sample of the water. The first attempt failed. The jar came up empty, as if it had passed through the water without capturing any. The second attempt brought up something, but it wasn't quite water. The liquid in the jar was thick, viscous, with that same reddish, brown color that had been reported before. When Cordry held it up to the light, the liquid seemed to move on its own, forming patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost purposeful. "What is that?" Grantham asked, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "I don't know," Cordry admitted. "I've never seen anything like it." He spent the rest of that day running tests on the sample. He added various chemicals, observed how they reacted with the liquid. He examined it under magnification. He measured its density, its viscosity, its response to heat and cold. None of his tests yielded results that made sense. The liquid behaved like water in some ways, but not in others. It had properties that shouldn't exist together, characteristics that violated basic principles of natural philosophy. That evening, Cordry asked to speak with Rachel. They met in the small office behind the counting house, an unusual request, but one that Grantham permitted, curious about what the professor might learn. Whitfield was present as well, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. "Mrs. Rachel," Cordry began, then paused. "I apologize. I don't know your family name." "Just Rachel," she said. Family names were complicated for enslaved people. Some had them, some didn't. Some used the names of former owners, some made up their own. Rachel had never bothered with one. "Rachel," he nodded. Then, Cordry said, "I've been told you were present when the previous owner died, Thomas Grantham, and that he said something about what's under the well." Rachel hesitated. Speaking too freely was dangerous, even with permission. But Cordry had kind eyes, and she was tired of carrying the secret alone. She glanced at Robert Grantham, who nodded his permission. "He said it was a seal," Rachel said carefully. "That his father found something in 1748, something old, and built the plantation over it to contain it. He said the well wasn't a well, and he said shadows were the key that could unlock it." Cordry nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He pulled out a map from his bag, spread it on the desk. It was a geological survey of the low country, marked with various symbols and notations. There are geological formations under this region, he said, pointing to various areas on the map that are extraordinarily ancient. Limestone caves, underground rivers, chambers that have been sealed off from the surface for millions of years. The limestone in this area is from the Cretaceous period, more than 65 million years old. Sometimes these chambers contain water that has been isolated for so long, it's developed unique chemical properties. He pulled out another document, this one covered in chemical formulas and diagrams. Some of this ancient water can be toxic. It can contain dissolved minerals in concentrations that affect the human brain, cause hallucinations, induce fever-like symptoms, even temporary paralysis. I've documented similar cases in caves in Virginia and Kentucky. You think that's what's under the well? Rachel asked. Poison water, I think, Cordry said carefully. That there is water down there that has properties we don't fully understand. Properties that can affect people in profound ways. The smell, the color, the sickness. Even the dreams you've described. They're all consistent with certain types of chemical exposure, specifically exposure to water containing high concentrations of dissolved metals, iron, copper, mercury, possibly others. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But there's something else. Something I found in the historical records that troubles me more than the chemistry. He pulled out another document, a journal from his bag, and opened it to a marked page. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting faded but still legible. In 1747, Cordry continued, there was a smallpox outbreak in this region. Very contained, very brief, only about 20 deaths, according to official records. But those deaths were all from one specific area, roughly where this plantation now stands. The outbreak stopped very suddenly, very completely, as if the source had been eliminated or contained. I don't understand, Rachel said, though a cold feeling was forming in her stomach. I think Thomas Grantham's father found something in 1748, Cordry said. I think he found a mass grave. People who had died of smallpox and had been buried quickly to prevent the spread of the disease. But I think it was more than just a burial site. I think it was a site where something went terribly wrong, where the disease itself mutated or concentrated in ways that made it more virulent than normal smallpox. He showed her another document, a letter written in cramped handwriting. This is from a doctor in Charleston, dated March 1747, he continued. He describes treating patients from this area who had symptoms unlike any smallpox he'd seen before. The progression was faster, the mortality rate higher, and the victims displayed unusual behaviors before death. Specifically, he notes that they all reported dreams of being underground, of hearing voices, of feeling something calling to them. Rachel felt her blood run cold. Those were the same symptoms people at Belmare had experienced. The doctor, Cordry continued, noted that the outbreak ended abruptly in April of 1747. His theory was that the source of infection had been eliminated, but he never learned what that source was. The area was quarantined, and by the time the quarantine was lifted, Thomas Grantham's father had purchased the land and begun building the plantation. So, he built on top of a plague site. Robert Grantham interjected, his voice sharp with anger. He knowingly built a plantation on contaminated ground. I believe he did, Cordry said, but I also believe he took precautions. The well was one of those precautions. It wasn't dug to find water. It was dug to act as a drainage system, a way to contain any contamination from the grave site below. The depth was deliberate, more than 200 feet down, far enough to reach the underground chambers where the contaminated water was pooling, far enough to create a release point that would prevent the contamination from spreading laterally through the soil. Rachel was beginning to understand, and the shadow rule. Cordry's expression became thoughtful. That's where my scientific explanation starts to break down, he said. Because I can explain the toxic water. I can explain the illness. I can even explain the dreams as hallucinations caused by metal poisoning. But I cannot explain why shadows would matter. I cannot explain the mechanism by which keeping shadows away from the well would prevent contamination. He leaned back in his chair, looking troubled. I have a theory, but it's not based on any science I can prove. I think Thomas Grantham understood something about human psychology. If you're trying to maintain a seal over contaminated ground, you need to monitor it constantly. You need to make sure nothing disturbs it, nothing breaks through. By creating an elaborate rule about shadows, he ensured that people would watch that well constantly, would never get close enough to accidentally damage the seal, would treat it with the respect and fear that such a dangerous site required. So, the shadow rule was just a way to keep people careful. Rachel asked, "That's my theory." But Cordry hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "There's one other thing. In 1747, the smallpox outbreak was described in a surviving letter as unnatural in its virulence. The people who died didn't just die of smallpox. According to the doctor's account, they died as if something was consuming them from within. Something more aggressive than any disease he'd ever seen. The symptoms progressed in a matter of hours, not days. And all of the victims in their final moments spoke of seeing shadows that moved independently, shadows that reached for them." The phrase sent chills down Rachel's spine. Shadows that moved independently. The Dr. Cordry continued, his voice barely above a whisper, called it a plague of shadow. He thought he was being poetic, describing the darkness of the disease. But what if he was being literal? What if there was something about shadow, about the absence of light, that allowed the disease to spread more effectively? Robert Grantham stood abruptly. "This is madness. You're talking about shadows as if they're a physical thing that can carry disease." "I'm talking about something I don't understand," Cordry said firmly. "And I'm honest enough to admit when my knowledge has limits. The science can explain most of what's happening here, but not all of it. The water level rising when it should be stable. The way the liquid we sampled behaves in ways that violate physical principles. The consistency of the symptoms across generations, despite the well being sealed." He turned to Rachel. "You asked what we should do. Here's my recommendation. Based on both science and precaution, the seal must be maintained and strengthened. Whatever's down there, whether it's simply toxic water or something more unusual, it must not reach the surface. The new seal should hold, but it needs to be monitored constantly and repaired immediately if any cracks appear." He paused, meeting her eyes. "And the shadow rule," he looked uncomfortable, "should be reinstated. I know it seems like superstition, and I cannot provide a scientific explanation for why it would matter. But I've learned in my years of study that sometimes practical wisdom exists before scientific understanding. The rule worked for 70 years. When it was abandoned, things went wrong. That's correlation, not causation. But in the absence of complete understanding, I would rather err on the side of caution." "You're asking me to convince Mr. Grantham to reinstate a rule based on superstition," Rachel said quietly. "I'm asking you to convince him to reinstate a rule based on observed results," Cordry corrected. "Superstition is belief without evidence. This rule has 70 years of evidence showing that it works, even if we don't understand the mechanism." Over the next 2 days, Cordry conducted more tests. He had workers dig test holes at various points around the plantation, measuring water tables, testing soil composition, mapping the underground structure. What he found troubled him deeply. The contaminated water was spreading slowly, almost imperceptibly, but spreading nonetheless. The water table across the plantation was rising, and chemical tests showed traces of the same unusual compounds found in the well water. It's as if the seal breaking had released some kind of pressure, allowing the contaminated water to begin seeping outward through underground channels, he told Robert Grantham and Rachel in a private meeting. At the current rate, the contamination will reach the rice fields within 5 years. Within 10 years, it will contaminate the Kahi River. Within 20 years, it could affect drinking water for every plantation within 20 miles. What can stop it? Grantham asked, his face pale. I don't know if anything can stop it, Cordry admitted. But I know what might slow it down. The original well system was designed as a pressure release. By sealing it completely, we may have disrupted that system. We might need to create a controlled release point, a way to let the pressure equalize without allowing the contaminated water to reach the surface. How would that work? Grantham asked. Cordry explained his plan. They would partially unseal the well, just enough to allow gas and pressure to escape, but not enough to allow liquid to rise. They would install a series of one-way valves based on technology used in mine ventilation systems. The valves would allow air and gas to escape upward, while preventing liquid from rising around this modified seal. They would create a monitoring system, a series of shallow wells that would allow them to track the water level and chemical composition, without directly accessing the main well. And the shadow rule? Rachel asked. Cordry looked uncomfortable. I recommend implementing a modified version, not as superstition, but as a safety protocol. The monitoring wells will need to be checked daily, and that work should be done with extreme caution, requiring workers to be aware of their shadows. To work only when shadows fall in certain directions ensures they're being deliberate and careful in their approach. It's not about the shadows themselves. It's about creating a ritual of carefulness around a dangerous site. Robert Grantham was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I won't call it the shadow rule, but I will implement safety protocols around the well that accomplish the same purpose, and I will assign dedicated watchers, people whose only job is to monitor these sites and report any changes. It was a compromise, but Cordry accepted it. Before he left Belmere, he spent an hour alone with Rachel, away from Grantham's hearing. I need to tell you something I didn't say in front of Mr. Grantham, Cordry said. My scientific explanation is the best theory I have, and I believe most of it is correct. The toxic water, the contaminated ground, the illness, all of that can be explained by natural processes. But there are details that don't fit. The way the liquid moves in patterns, the consistency of the dreams across multiple people, the way shadows seem to correlate with outbreaks of illness. What are you saying? Rachel asked. I'm saying that there are phenomena in the natural world we don't yet understand. Things that might seem supernatural, but are actually natural processes operating on principles we haven't discovered. Light and shadow affect all sorts of chemical and biological processes. Plants grow toward light. Some chemical reactions only occur in darkness. Some bacteria thrive in the absence of light, while others die without it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What if the contamination in that well is something similar? What if it's a natural phenomenon, but one so unusual, so rare that it seems supernatural? What if it's genuinely affected by light and shadow in ways we don't understand yet? You don't believe that, Rachel said. Not really. Cordry smiled sadly. I don't know what I believe. I've spent my life trying to explain the world through reason and observation. But I've also learned that the world is stranger than we imagine. Keep watching the well, Rachel. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if people start getting sick again, if the dreams return, don't wait for scientific confirmation. Act immediately. Because whatever's down there, whether it's toxic water or something more unusual, it's dangerous. And the shadow rule, whatever its true purpose, has kept it contained for a long time. He left Belmere the next day, taking his samples and notes back to Charleston. But he left behind detailed instructions for the monitoring system and the modified seal. He also left behind something else of doubt. Rachel could see it in Robert Grantham's eyes. The uncertainty, the fear that he didn't fully understand what he was dealing with. The implementation of Cordry's plan took weeks. Workers carefully modified the seal, installing the pressure release valves according to Cordry's specifications. The monitoring wells were dug at precise locations, creating a ring around the main well. Each monitoring well was marked with white stones, not painted, but naturally white limestone that Grantham ordered brought in from a quarry near Charleston. And though he refused to call it the shadow rule, Grantham did implement protocols that accomplished the same purpose. The monitoring wells could only be checked at certain times of the day, when the sun's angle created shadows that fell in safe directions. Workers assigned to check the wells had to work in pairs, with one watching while the other approached. Anyone who felt ill or experienced unusual dreams after working near the wells was immediately reassigned to different duties and monitored for symptoms. It wasn't the shadow rule, but it was close enough, and it worked. For months after Cordry's modifications, an uneasy peace settled over Belmare. The monitoring wells showed that the water level was stabilizing. The pressure release system seemed to be working, venting off gases that gave off that same metallic smell, but preventing the liquid from rising. The dreams became less frequent, though they never entirely stopped. People stopped getting sick, though there was always an underlying anxiety, a sense that something was being held at bay rather than truly resolved. Rachel kept her promise to Cordry. She watched the wells, all of them, every day. She paid attention to the white stone markers, to the patterns of shadows, to the times when people approached the monitoring system. She noticed things that others missed. How the smell from the vents varied with the weather, stronger on humid days, and weaker when the air was dry. How people who worked near the wells in the early morning reported fewer problems than those who worked in the late afternoon. How the dreams seemed to intensify during the dark of the moon and fade during the full moon. She kept notes, writing them carefully in a small journal that Isaac had made for her from scraps of paper and leather. She couldn't write well. She taught herself in secret, picking up letters and words from the documents she saw in the main house, but she wrote well enough to record what she observed. The journal became a record of the well's behavior, a catalog of patterns and correlations that might mean something, or might mean nothing. Isaac, for his part, became the primary person responsible for maintaining the modified seal. His blacksmith skills made him valuable for repairs, and his meticulous nature meant he could be trusted to follow Cordry's specifications exactly. He took the work seriously, understanding that lives depended on it. He taught his son Abel the same skills, creating a succession plan that would ensure the seal was maintained even after he was gone. Little Thomas recovered fully from his fever, though he was changed by it. He became quieter, more thoughtful, prone to staring at the sealed well with an expression that Rachel couldn't quite read. When she asked him what he remembered from his time on top of the seal, he would shake his head and say he didn't remember anything, but she knew he was lying. Something had happened to him up there, something he'd seen or heard or felt, and he'd chosen to keep it to himself. Robert Grantham, meanwhile, threw himself into modernizing Belmare. He installed new irrigation systems for the rice fields, built a small school for the children of the enslaved population, where they could learn basic reading and arithmetic skills that increased their value as workers, and even experimented with crop rotation to improve soil quality. It was as if he was trying to prove that Belmare could be normal, that the well was just a well, that science and reason could explain everything. But Rachel noticed that he never went near the well, never personally checked the monitoring system, never stood where his shadow might fall across those white stone markers. For all his talk of reason and science, he was afraid, and that fear, more than anything else, told Rachel that he knew the truth. They hadn't solved the problem. They just contained it temporarily. The seasons turned. 1822 became 1823. The modified seal held, but it required constant maintenance. Valves had to be cleaned. Stones had to be replaced when they cracked. The monitoring wells had to be checked daily for changes in water level or chemical composition. It was a full-time job, and Grantham assigned 3 people to do it: Isaac, a man named Caleb, who had a gift for detailed work, and eventually little Thomas when he was old enough. During this time, Rachel began to notice something else. The people who worked maintaining the seal changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that made them sick, but in subtle ways. They became more attuned to the well, more sensitive to its rhythms. They could feel when something was wrong before any instruments detected it. They had dreams that seemed to give them warnings about potential problems. Isaac described it to Rachel one night as they lay in bed, speaking in whispers. "It's like the well is talking," he said. "Not with words, but with feelings. I'll be working on one of the valves, and I'll suddenly feel uneasy, like I need to check something. And when I check it, I'll find a crack or a weak point that wasn't there the day before. Or I'll have a dream about one of the monitoring wells. And the next day, sure enough, the water level in that exact well will have changed." "Are you saying the well is alive?" Rachel asked, feeling cold. No, I don't think it's alive. But I think there's something down there that's aware. Something that wants to communicate, or at least make itself known. And the closer you work to it, the more you can feel it. Maybe you should stop working on the seal, Rachel said.
Can't.
Who else would do it? And besides, I don't think it's trying to hurt us. I think it's trying to warn us. Like it knows that if it breaks through, if it reaches the surface, that would be bad for everyone. Bad for us, bad for the plantation. Bad for whatever's down there, too. Rachel didn't know what to make of that. The idea that the contamination, or whatever was in that, while might be trying to help them maintain the seal seemed absurd. But she also knew that Isaac wasn't prone to flights of fancy. If he said he felt something, he felt something. Years passed. The modified seal became a permanent feature of Belmer's landscape. The white stone markers became familiar, almost reassuring in their constancy. New people arrived at the plantation, bought or transferred from other properties, and they were taught about the well, about the protocols for approaching it, about the importance of careful maintenance. The shadow rule, even though it was never officially called that, was passed down through demonstration and warning. See those white stones? A mother would tell her child, never let your shadow fall past them. Why not? The child would ask, because that's the rule. It keeps us safe. You don't question it. You just follow it. And they did, because even the newest arrivals could feel it. That sense of wrongness around the well, that instinctive understanding that this was a place where normal rules didn't apply. In 1835, Robert Grantham died of a stroke. He was 56 years old. His will left Belmer to his oldest son, Marcus Grantham, a young man of 23 who had been educated in Philadelphia and had modern ideas about plantation management. Marcus arrived full of plans to revolutionize rice cultivation, to implement new techniques he'd learned up north. But he also arrived with something else, a healthy respect for things he didn't understand. Before his father died, Robert Grantham had spent an evening with Marcus, telling him about the well, about Dr. Cordry's investigation, about the shadow rule and the modified seal. Marcus listened. And though he was skeptical, he was also smart enough to recognize that some precautions were worth maintaining. Even if you didn't fully understand their purpose, the well stays sealed, Marcus told Isaac on his first day at Belmer. The monitoring system stays in place. The protocols stay in force. I don't care if they're based on science or superstition. They work, and we're not changing them. Isaac felt a wave of relief. He'd been worried that the new master would want to modernize everything, including the well management. But Marcus proved to be practical. He did implement new techniques for rice cultivation, did build new structures, and improve living conditions for the enslaved population. Not out of kindness, but because healthy workers were more productive workers. But he left the well alone. During Marcus's tenure, an interesting thing happened. The well became less active. The smell from the vents diminished. The monitoring wells showed the water level slowly dropping. The dreams became rare, then stopped almost entirely. It was as if whatever was down there was settling, finding equilibrium, accepting its containment. Cordry visited once more in 1841, now an old man of 72. He examined the monitoring data that had been carefully maintained over the years, conducted new tests on samples from the monitoring wells, and pronounced himself satisfied. Whatever is happening has stabilized, he told Marcus Grantham and Rachel, who at 69 was still working in the main house, though at lighter duties now. The pressure release system worked. The contamination isn't spreading. If you maintain the seal, if you continue the monitoring protocols, this site should remain stable indefinitely. What about the shadow rule? Rachel asked. She'd waited 19 years to ask him that question again. Cordry smiled. You know, I've thought about that over the years. I've studied more about light and shadow, about how they affect chemical and biological processes, and I've come to a conclusion that might surprise you. I think the shadow rule was never about shadows. I think it was about time, he explained. The sun's position determines where shadows fall. By requiring people to be conscious of their shadows, You were really requiring them to work at specific times of day, when the sun was at specific angles. And I've noticed, looking at your records, that problems at the well correlate with specific times of day. Early morning and late afternoon seem to be the safest times for work. Midday and evening seem to be more dangerous. Why? Rachel asked. I don't know, Cordry admitted. Maybe it's related to temperature fluctuations. Maybe it's related to atmospheric pressure. Maybe it's something else entirely. But the shadow rule, by forcing people to work only when shadows fell in certain directions, ensured they were working during the safest times. So it was science all along? Rachel asked. It was practical wisdom that happened to align with science, Cordry said, which is often how progress works. People observe what works, create rules based on those observations, and only later do we understand the mechanisms behind those rules. Your former master, Thomas Grantham, may not have understood why the shadow rule worked, but he observed that it did work, and he enforced it rigorously. That was genius in its way. Cordry left Belmare for the last time, and Rachel never saw him again. He died 3 years later in Charleston at the age of 75. But his modifications to the well remained, and the protocols he'd helped establish continued. When Union soldiers arrived at Belmare in March of 1865, they found a functioning plantation with 93 enslaved people still working the rice fields, despite the war raging across the South. The overseer had fled weeks earlier, taking what portable valuables he could carry. Marcus Grantham had died of fever in 1863, and his widow had abandoned the plantation months before, fleeing to relatives in Charleston. But the people remained, because where else would they go? A Union captain named Miles Garrett took command of the plantation temporarily, overseeing the transition from slavery to freedom. He was a practical man from Massachusetts, educated in engineering, and he was immediately curious about the sealed structure in the workyard, about the system of monitoring wells surrounding it, about why people seemed so careful never to stand too close to it, never to let their shadows fall on those white stone markers. Why do you all avoid it? He asked an elderly woman named Rachel, who at 73 years old was the oldest person at Belmare and seemed to be treated with quiet respect by everyone else. Rachel looked at the sealed well for a long moment before she answered. She'd been expecting this question for months, knowing that eventually someone in authority would ask it, would want to know why Belmare's former enslaved population maintained such strange habits around an apparently ordinary sealed structure. There's something underneath, she said finally. Something that needs to stay underneath. The shadow rule kept it there for a long time. When the rule was broken, it almost came up. We sealed it again, and we've been watching it ever since. The shadow rule? Garrett asked, his engineering mind immediately intrigued. Rachel explained, telling him the history of the well, the 73 years of rigid enforcement, the breakdown when Robert Grantham abolished the rule, Dr. Cordry's investigation, the modified seal. She showed him the journals she and Isaac had kept, decades of observations about the well's behavior, correlations between shadow positions and safety, notes about dreams, illnesses, and strange occurrences. Garrett listened with increasing fascination. When she finished, he asked permission to examine the sealed well more closely. Rachel granted it, though with obvious reluctance. Garrett spent 2 days examining the structure, taking measurements, studying Cordry's modifications, testing the valves, and monitoring wells. On the 3rd day, he called a meeting with Rachel, Isaac, little Thomas, now 44 years old, and several other people who had been involved in maintaining the seal. I've never seen anything like this, Garrett admitted. The engineering is sophisticated, well beyond what I would have expected for the 1820s. The pressure release system is genius. The monitoring network is comprehensive. Whoever designed this understood containment engineering at a level comparable to modern mine safety systems. Dr. Cordry designed it, Rachel said. Then Dr. Cordry was ahead of his time. Garrett paused, choosing his words carefully. I've read your journals. I've examined the monitoring data. And I've noticed the correlations you've documented between shadow positions and safety. I can't explain them scientifically, but I also can't deny they exist. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. He looked at each of them in turn. You're free now, all of you. You can leave Belmare if you want, but if you stay, if you continue to maintain this seal, I'll make sure you're compensated for your work. And I'll make sure that the importance of this site is documented with the military authorities, so that even after I leave, there will be official recognition that this place requires ongoing maintenance. We'll stay, Isaac said immediately. Several others nodded in agreement. Good, Garrett said. Because I think you're right. I think there is something under there that needs to stay under there. And I think your shadow rule, whatever its original purpose, has been effective in keeping it contained. He kept his word. Before he left Belmare 6 months later, he filed a detailed report with the military authorities describing the sealed well, the monitoring system, and the protocols for its maintenance. He recommended that the site be placed under permanent federal protection, with the current residents given legal authority to continue their maintenance work. The recommendation was approved, though it took years for the bureaucracy to catch up. Eventually, the people of Belmare were granted legal ownership of the land surrounding the well, with the provision that the seal must be maintained in perpetuity. It was an unusual arrangement, but the federal authorities had bigger concerns in the chaos of reconstruction. And if the former enslaved people of Belmare wanted to maintain a strange sealed structure, there was no reason to stop them. Rachel lived until 1872, dying at the age of 80, which was remarkable for anyone of her generation. In her final days, she was surrounded by her family, her daughter Judith, her grandson little Thomas, her great-grandchildren. She had seen the plantation system born and die, had seen her people go from enslaved to free, had seen the well through every phase of its strange existence. Before she died, she made little Thomas promise to keep watching the well, to keep teaching the young ones about the shadow rule and why it mattered, to make sure that what had been sealed stayed sealed. Do you really believe there's something down there? Little Thomas asked her, hoping for a final answer after all these years. Rachel smiled, the same enigmatic smile she'd worn when people asked her difficult questions throughout her long life. Does it matter what I believe? She replied. The rule works. The seal holds. Our people are safe. That's what matters. In the years that followed, the well at Belmare remained sealed, its secrets locked beneath layers of concrete and iron. The land around it continued to thrive, the rice fields flourished, and the people of Belmare carried on with their lives. The memory of the shadow rule passed down like an unspoken legacy. As the plantation changed hands and time moved forward, the well faded into the background of the world, forgotten by most. Yet, those who knew its history, who had once lived under its shadow, never truly let go of the warning it carried. They understood that some boundaries, no matter how strange or inexplicable, exist for a reason. The well still waits, its seal intact, its mystery unresolved, standing as a silent testament to the power of fear, caution, and the things buried too deep to understand. The shadow rule may be gone, but the vigilance it demanded lives on, echoing through the generations. Some secrets are better left untouched, and some seals, it seems, are meant to hold forever.